Okay, so tell me, because I think I missed this part. What is your job? Are you just a relationship coach?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. My specialization is in sex therapy. So I started out early in my career when I got licensed. I actually worked primarily with kids because I worked for the Child Behavioral Health Initiative through Massachusetts.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
oh, I think we chatted about this, but yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that program so much. But I mean, as you know, it was so very stressful.
Yes.
So I had always wanted to go into the sex therapy side of things, but that position actually really helps because I mean, you know that when I was working with, I would get contracted to work with the kids, right? But then I always ended up just kind of working more with the parents and on their dynamics. So that's what kind of lent me into doing more couples work. And then through that, I got really interested in sex therapy. So
Oh, I love that. It's so funny because I started in CVHI and did a lot of like the in-home therapy, like all that stuff, loved it. But my thing was always working with like the teenagers. Like I wanted like the high risk kids. I wanted the kids that were like really impulsive. I wanted to work with the families that didn't know what else to fucking do, right? Like, that was always my jam. And working with like such high risk kids, I was like, there has to be a way that I can do this in private practice, not have to like stay as part of that because like you're not making a ton of money.
yeah, none of us are in this for the money. I always joke to my clients about that. It's a good
No.
thing.
Right. But it's funny how like you start at the same place and you kind of end in like these different like unique niches. And I'm so glad to have you on the show today because I have so many questions. Like one of the things that I spend so much time talking about is like the impact of relationships, the impact of like early sexual experiences, right, on like teens. And I always talk about how like those experiences lay the groundwork for whatever relationship they end up in long term. Right. And I would love to pick your brain just on like how like truthful I guess that is and like where you see like all of those pieces kind of coming together. Because this podcast is all about like obviously talking about teens, but I want it to be something where providers can utilize it, parents can utilize it, and we're giving like really good information on like, how do we do it? How do we talk to teens about that stuff? How do we make them understand the seriousness sometimes of those relationships and early experiences and how do we talk about it? So I don't know. You can jump in wherever you want. That's a lot of questions, but
No, that's okay. No, I love that, and I think that that was one of the populations I used to really struggle with, right? Because I'm all about communication, and teenagers don't like to communicate, right? So that was always so you're doing amazing work that you're doing all this. Yeah, so no, I mean, first off, I think that's a great question how the early experiences shape relationships because I hear that all the time from clients. Clients who are in their 40s will say, well, my first boyfriend, they did this, or, my first girlfriend or my first time. So I think, first experiences are hugely important, right? And they kind of a lot of times can set the groundwork for what you know, the formulation of how you think about relationships, right? What you think is normal, what you think is to be expected, and we just go off of those lessons.
yes. Okay. So that is like so comforting because I was like, I feel like I've been saying that. And I'm not a relationship therapist in the way of like, I don't necessarily do like sex therapy, but I've always thought about this idea of like relationship kind of like therapy or like relationship coaching with like teens, particularly because I feel like if they were able to get, and we're really jumping into it today, but I was like, if they could get into a space where they had someone that was overseeing and watching and having discussions and helping them communicate those things, right? How much trauma and miscommunication and like maladaptive behaviors and relationships that we see with people in their 20s, 30s, 40s could we like interrupt, right? And actually like do better just by giving them that opportunity.
Yes. I actually, so one of the big things I talk to a lot of my clients about that have teenage, and I would even say preteen kids is one of the jokes is like people say like, "Oh, when should we have the talk?" And this is my biggest piece of advice for people is people always frame it as this like singular event of where you talk to your kid about sex and relationships. And my big push is always this should be an ongoing, continual conversation, right? Like there might be that first talk of where you introduce what the concept of sex is, like, but that is something I see a lot because a lot of teenagers, I mean, honestly, a lot of adults struggle with navigating what they like in the bedroom or how to communicate their wants and needs in a relationship. And that to me is something that it's so nuanced and complex. And I laugh because I'm like, we as adults, we go to couples therapy. I typically work with people from anywhere, 6 months is my minimum, but I have couples I've been seeing for 10 years now, and they're still working on communication. But with teenagers, we kind of give them one little half-hour talk that's awkward, and then we say, okay, let us know if you have any questions. Good luck with that. Have fun. Yeah, exactly. And then good luck.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also really interesting the amount of parents who like don't want their kids dating
Yes.
at
Hmm.
all. Like they're like, no, you can do that once you turn 18. You can do that when you're in college, right?
Yeah.
And it's
Hmm.
interesting because I actually feel like that would be counterintuitive for offering like the support and the stability and like navigating some of those things and offering them like conversation around it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think in a way that's a great point. It builds it up to this high stakes pressure thing, right? This is something you can only do as an adult or you can only do once you're married, right? And I see that also kind of blends into where I see a lot of people having issues with like pressure around dating or pressure around sex because it was sort of this like forbidden thing that kind of had a negative connotation as opposed to like, oh, at every stage in life you get to graduate to more and more adult things, right? And we kind of frame it as like this negative, scary pressure thing as opposed to this, positive thing you're going to ease into throughout your adult life.
Yeah. Well, so I'm curious from your perspective because you work a lot with adults, obviously doing like the sex therapy piece. And I'm curious, like when, because I talk a lot with my teens about like when do you know you're ready for sex, right? Like, or when do you know you're ready to like do anything physical, right? Whether it's like sex or like other things, right? Do you have like I don't know, like a frame of mind for like how, based on all the experience you have with like the adults, like what would indicate someone is kind of like ready or when they should maybe pause and like give themselves more time?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. I would say, I think, that's a great way to frame it is just when are you ready in terms of emotional maturity. And as a sex therapist who's worked with a lot of adults, I would say the biggest indicator to me would be when you can communicate your boundaries, when you can communicate. And I think, I don't know about you, but I feel like boundaries has kind of gotten this like really big buzzword in therapy and like not always in the best way, right? Um, but I see a lot of people who, and I'll work with some people who say, well, I don't know what I want, so how can I communicate that? And I say, well, how about just starting there, right? Being open with a partner about, hey, I don't have a lot of experience, so I might just want to kiss today, or I might be okay with you feeling certain parts of my body, but I might at a certain point also have to say no. Like I think and that's kind of what I was talking about, the high stakes pressure. I think with a lot of people, they kind of go into it with sort of this, am I ready or am I not? And they kind of have to figure that out for themselves. And then they decide to do it. It's like, well, in any sexual encounter, you may, get to a certain point in that specific encounter, need to back off or want to go even more forward than you thought you would, right? It doesn't always have to be saying no. It could be saying yes to more. So I think when kids are emotionally ready is really around when they can articulate what it is they want and be comfortable with saying that to another person.
Yes. I love that. And I'm thinking about it even in terms of like I feel like when you've reached that point in a relationship, especially a lot of teenagers, they're like, well, we've already done oral, right? And so it's like that is a thing that's like checkbox, always okay, right? And what's interesting is I talk a lot about that. I'm just like, so just because you've done it once or you've talked about it once does not give explicit continued consent, right? And so like having them understand that concept where they can like give permission and consent and they can also take that away, right? Depending on the circumstances, situation, whatever, I think is a really solid indicator that someone is like ready to adapt, right? To like whatever that is. Because if you have like I have a lot of teens that are like, well, I've already done it once, it doesn't matter. Like we can just do that all the time. And I'm like, but think about what you're saying, right? If you're having a really awful day, right? And let's say it's like oral sex is already on the table and your partner is like, I want this now. And you're like, are you freaking kidding me? I'm like super upset. I had a terrible day. And like, that's all you're thinking about, right? So when you think about it in that terms, it's kind of like, there has to be like a negotiation, right, interpersonally with like how they're going to manage all those things. And I don't think that teens understand like a how explicit they can be about that, and then how like supportive and strong it can be when you already put your boundaries out there.
Yes, yes. And I really do. It's so funny. I know we talk about the difference with teenagers, but that I really wish we taught more kids in that way, because I can't explain how many adults I see who are in a happy, loving relationship. It's not that their partner isn't supportive or that they're not a great person, but they can't even in a, long-term committed relationship with a house and a kids communicate like, hey, emotionally I'm in this state, so I don't want to do this, or emotionally I am in this state, so I'm really looking forward to it, right? And just like really being able to communicate your wants and needs. It's just I think it's, a lot of people struggle with it.
Yeah, totally. And I do think it's a part of it is because we make it awkward. We make it weird to like talk about. And I totally get like when a lot of teens like their first interaction with that might be like, talking about it with your parents and like who wants to talk about sex with your parents. Um, but I do think that making sure that they have other connections and people that are trustworthy, that are responsible, they can like also help engage those conversations around like safety and consent and like boundaries, right? Is super important. And so when I work with teens, like I always bring sex up in like the first handful of sessions because I want them to know that like I'm not scared of talking about it. There's nothing that they can like say or do that's going to be weird or offensive or like, like inappropriate to me, because I want them to know that if they're struggling with something like that, like they can bring that into session and it's okay.
Yeah, yeah. I love that so much because I think that that is such an important part, right? Because and it's funny, my kids, I have a 7 and a 3-year-old, so they're not quite there yet. I've started to explain some things to my son. But I fully recognize I'm a sex therapist. They're not going to want to talk to me as their mom about sex later in life, and I fully appreciate that. But we'll kind of do an approach where I'll say, "Hey, talk to an adult you trust," right? Maybe they have like an aunt or like I had like I had really supportive people growing up, like a best friend's mom or something like that. So I always say like, hey, like, um, if you're a parent and you're dealing with a teen, kind of identify who those people might be, right? Maybe there's something like, hey, if always encourage, like you can always come ask me questions, but if you don't feel comfortable, right, talking to your mom or your dad about your sex life, well, yeah, go to that trusted adult that might be open about it, or right, a therapist who's open to talking about it. So I think that community aspect to it, if it was to your point, if it wasn't so siloed, it would probably feel a lot less awkward for a lot of people. Otherwise, they're just going to their friends who are also learning everything off of TikTok and they're not getting good information. I'm like, they're all getting information, which TikTok's gotten better, don't get me wrong, but I'm like, yeah, they're all going to their friends to ask questions and none of them know what they're doing.
Can I tell you, I can't even tell you the amount of times that I have like literally corrected or like looked up information like in a session because I've had kids come in to be like, well, so and so said blah 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 blah, right? Which is like totally inaccurate of like sex or how bodies work or whatever. And so what I try to tell parents is that like you don't want the first narrative your child has about how their body works and about sex to be from a peer, right? Excuse me. And not that that is because that it's a bad thing, but it's because you want them to get the right information the first time. Because I do feel like it takes longer to kind of like unlearn those pieces and then to relearn the new pieces than it does just to be like, here's the reality of your body and how things work. And like we want you to know that.
Yeah. No, I've told this story before where I had a friend when I was younger. I was probably, 12 or something, and she told me, "Oh, if a guy gets erect and, he doesn't finish, like it's really painful, right?" And I'm a therapist, I'm a really empathetic person, and that stuck with me for years, even though I learned that that's not accurate, right? For years, I would always, "Oh my gosh, if I don't want to get anybody like too excited because that could be bad," or right. And I that's such a good point, right? Unlearning those things, it just sticks with you even after you've learned that they're not factually accurate.
I mean, the one that will always kill me. I was a bio major in college. And I feel like I impulsively made the best decision ever to become a therapist, right? This was not in my lifetime plan, but it has been the best journey ever. And so when I was teaching during my student teaching years, I was with middle schoolers and high schools. And they literally would ask like the funniest questions, but they were real because they didn't know, right? So I had this one girl who like wrote, I still don't know who it was, obviously, but we wrote anonymously like all these questions, right? Of like, what happens if this happens? Because we are a reproductive system, and I wanted them to like understand, and I wanted them to like feel free to ask questions. And this one girl was like, "Can I get pregnant by swallowing sperm?" Like that literally was her question. And I was like, that's a great question. And like, we spent 25 minutes talking about that. 25 minutes, right? Because they honest to God were like, yes, no, maybe. I mean, what if she had a cut in her stomach? Like there were all these questions they had had. And I was like, let's actually talk about the reality of this. And like that was me as their bio teacher. Versus like now when I talk about different things and I'm just like, I want you to have this information, even though I know it's awkward and weird to talk about, but like I'm always going to be the safe person and we can talk about anything from like straight up sex to kinks to whatever, because I want you to have a solid person to go to for that. Right. And of course I'm not a sex therapist, but I've learned a lot and I have a lot of friends that are sex therapists. And I do feel like as a therapist, when we're talking about like holistic health and wellness, how can we sit there and say, well, I'm supporting all of you, but we're not willing to talk about sex?
Yes, yes. I know. You know what? It's so funny. I see, and no, I don't think this is a bad thing necessarily, but I get a lot of referrals from other couples therapists who will say like they're struggling with sexual dysfunction or sexual incompatibility, and you specialize in this, so you can treat this. And I'll say, okay, like, I completely understand you don't want to, practice outside your scope of expertise, and I think that's amazing, right? But I am always so surprised by that, how many referrals I get from couples therapists who specifically don't feel comfortable really getting into they'll do the surface level, but don't feel comfortable getting into the nitty gritty. So I think just overall, it's such a hard topic to talk about. And again, relating it back to teens, I'm like, we as adults struggle to talk about it. So how do we expect our kids to know how to navigate this?
Totally. And I think that's like, I talk so much in my practice about like role modeling, right? And leading the way. And like I made a TikTok the other day because I was like, if you are a parent who wants your kid to be accountable, but you can't be accountable yourself, how do you expect them to like learn that thing? And I feel like the same way goes with like talking about sex and like difficult conversations and conflict and problem solving, right? Like all of those things are things that you as a parent are going to role model for them. And then they're going to pick up, right, what vibes with them. And you should continue that conversation and figure out like what's a fit for them. And I think the same thing with like sex. And I think that's a big part of why it's so taboo, is that it's like nobody wants to talk about it. But I also think that leads us into like these really gray, awful areas of like people getting assaulted, people like not understanding like, what sex is and what sex means for them and like what that really entails, how that impacts like long-term relationships. And then also like the gender piece that comes into it sometimes when you have those initial experiences and like, what does that even mean for me now if I don't feel so it's just really wild that we're like, we'll talk about all these other things, but we won't talk about sex.
Yes, yes, I know, I know. I do get in trouble sometimes. My husband does always remind me because I'll just start talking about stuff sometimes, and he's like, "Not everyone is as comfortable with this as you are." So I always need to remind to like check myself.
I mean, but in a way, we should be, because I feel like, when I think about the work I do with teenagers, I'm like, I'm helping like bring the next generation of like young humans into adulthood, right? And I do take that very seriously. And that is the same thing where like I have some of my like long-term clients now that will be like, hey, we have to talk about what happened last weekend. And they divulge this entire like, sexual encounter. And they're like, so I don't know what to do about this, or I don't know what to do about that. It's like, I can't even imagine if they didn't have a me, who they would be talking to about that.
You know what's funny when we talk about later relationships, right? I love the phenomenon when I've seen someone who meets a really healthy, emotionally regulated person and they've never encountered someone like that in a relationship, and just how cathartic it can be for the person who's grown up in, not even toxic relationships, but sometimes just not great relationships, right? And they meet someone who's just really well adjusted and, can articulate their emotions and communicate really well. And I think that's just amazing that you're right. These kids are learning as young adults, and that they're going to go out in the world and not just navigate that, but they're going to help people navigate. I think that's huge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think about teens in terms of like, at some point they have their own bodily autonomy, right? They have the ability to make choices, and sometimes it's younger for certain kids, right? And I think that there's a beautiful power in being able to like support and embrace that versus trying to fight against it. And I think that's the same thing that goes with like sex and relationships. Like I do think that there are conversations you should have if you feel like your kid is like maybe not ready and you're just like, I don't think you understand what this is, right? Um, but at the end of the day, like I would not want them to make a decision because they were upset with a boundary versus like really being able to understand what that meant for them, right? Because like with all my high risk kiddos, if I told them not to do something, they'd be like that, right? And
Yeah.
then like
Let
the
me go
next,
towards that exact thing.
right, and then like the next week they're gonna be like, so I did the thing that we said I wasn't gonna do, and I'm just like, okay, tell me about that, right? Which I know those are conversations that obviously happen, but I feel like when you can be productive and proactive, you're gonna have people that are just like so much more well adjusted, which I'm sure you've seen in your work.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I would say unfortunately is a little bit of a rarer case. My person who comes, they're like, I've been doing years of therapy and I can communicate in this way, which is amazing. But I really do see the cathartic effect they have um on their partners, or when you get two people that can really step into that and be able to talk openly and freely. Um, I think you brought up a good point though too, because I think a lot of times we see things from the side of, oh, all teenagers think about is sex, right? And that and I mean, for a large population, that's definitely true. But I do think those are also valid conversations, right? Seeing the kid that isn't ready and embracing that too, saying like, hey, all your friends might be really interested in this or interested in this aspect of things or dating. And I definitely know plenty of kids who, right, they just mature. I wouldn't even say mature, that's probably not the right word, but that aspect of their identity, is slower to develop, and that's also totally okay.
Yeah. Or like I have a kid I'm working with right now. She's so sassy and fun. And she's like, if I'm dating, I'm dating to marry. Very serious about that. And I think that there is a really lovely protection with that, where she's like, I'm not gonna like do those things with anyone unless I really feel like a serious commitment. And I think that that is like a really beautiful thing. And then I have other people who are like, I don't ever care if I'm in a relationship or like, whatever that is for them. And I think that's another beautiful part. Like, I just love supporting people with what they really want in the future for themselves. And like when I grew up, it was this thing where it was expected that you were going to like marry a man and you were going to like have children and you were going to be some sort of stay-at-home parent, right? And I love offering the idea and the alternative narratives of like, you don't have to marry anyone if you don't want to, and you don't ever have to have sex if you don't want to. And there's all these different combinations at this point. And I love like the freedom I think that like people have now to kind of explore all of that and to really figure out like what sex means for them versus what it meant for your parents might be very different, or what it means to your friends.
Yeah, yeah. Do you see this a lot in because this is even something I would say that's evolved in my practice over the past 10 years, is kind of talking about this concept of flexibility, right? And that your needs, your desires, part of your identity might even like change and fluctuate, right? I don't know. When I was growing up, I feel like it was sort of, okay, you had to decide like, are you gay or are you straight or are you bi, right? And you had to pick when you were 18, you had to pick which one you were, and like that's who you were. And like, kind of that idea of like, well, throughout your lifespan, things like really like develop and change. And even that idea, maybe you're someone who starts out and you never want to have that, typical relationship and get married and have kids. But then what happens if you meet someone and you fall in love with them and you're like, oh, now I want all that. But I think that's, or vice versa. Oh, I wanted this and now it's changed. I think that's really, I don't know. Do you see that a lot with kids of, hey, your worldview might, change, and that's okay to have that flexibility?
Yeah, yeah. And it's actually really interesting because what I've seen more of is that once the kid or the teen has like maybe come out or has decided they want a certain thing, the parents seem to stick with that. And so it's like you have the parent who's like, remember, Tommy, you said you wanted blah, 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 blah. And that's never going to happen if like this, right? And it's wild to me that like once the kid says something, right, the parent, and I appreciate the genuine nature of like, okay, this is what you said it is, so I'm going to accept that. But I do sometimes think that puts kids in a box because you're like, wait a minute, no, I can't change because like my parents have already said this. I'm already giving them this information of this is what I want. And so that's definitely part of the work we do is like a family session. But I generally think the kids are actually more flexible than we give them credit for in understanding kind of like all of those things. And I always talk about, because I also work with a ton of like LGBTQ kids and I like love it. But I think that I always talk about sexuality and gender as gender presentation as part of like an evolving system, right? So like I'm very different now than I was 20 years ago. And the way that I like present and am, I'm much more aligned with I think who I am as a human versus like when I was 13, I want to say, I came out and I was like, oh, I'm bi, right? And then very quickly I was like, oh no, like I'm not bi, right? I think I'm just a lesbian. But because of everything else, it was like, well, I have to date men and I have to do this and I have to, do all these other things and I have to grow up and get married and have kids and whatever. But it's just really interesting how like I see myself, and I was like a baby dyke, like in the way of like, me in high school and college, I was like really trying to like, because that's what I thought lesbianism was this presentation. And now like you see me nowadays, and I'm just like, I'm very much your like punk rock, like emo, kid at heart, but I'm also like incredibly feminine, but have like the masculine part of me that's at work. And so like all of that is way more aligned than it was before. Because I thought I had to be like, I thought that was the identity I had to have to be part of this like community and part of this culture. And so I always talk about how like it is an evolving door, and like it is absolutely okay for you to make different choices, even in regards to like what you like and don't like in sex and partnership, and that we need to be open to that because we'll never know. There might be something that hits you in the face and you're like, I was never prepared for this.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that's why I love that foundational concept of being able to communicate wants and needs and desires from an early age. Because again, I think even it's so funny, we kind of see like both ends, like the young adults and like I'll see older adults. Like I'll see people in their I actually had one couple. I love them so much. I had a couple in their 80s that one of the partners had this huge sexual awakening when she was like 79 years old, and it changed her perspective on just how she wanted to be with her part. And it was beautiful. They ended up like really coming together over it, but it was just so funny that they did joke. They're like, oh, we have to be your oldest clients that have ever like embarked on this kind of journey. And I was like, well, yeah, you guys are definitely up there, but I'm glad you're figuring it out. Um, but yeah, I just love that concept of being able to really work on, you know, identifying things for yourself and being able to communicate that to the people that are important around you, right? Because it does shift so much throughout your lifespan, and having the skills to communicate that, you can kind of take on any transformation that your life probably will take at many points, right?
And I think it's such an awesome kind of baseline to talk about like sexual readiness, to be like if you're not able to have that conversation with a partner about like boundaries or consent or whatever, like you're probably not there quite yet. Um, and what I've seen that's really interesting is I have a lot of kids that like maybe have had sex and now they're with a new partner, and the new partner is like expecting sex because they've already had sex, but they're like not ready and they're trying to just like do better by themselves. Um, and that's always a really interesting conversation too, because a lot of times the partners are like, well, you've already had sex. Like, why does it matter? Um, so like then we spend a lot of time talking about like what are the red flags in a relationship is as far as like the sexual coercion or like, those unhealthy dynamics that I'm sure you see too.
Oh, yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think that's a big thing too. I talk to a lot of the parents I see is, I think that's one aspect we'll talk about a lot is expressing consent and knowing how to navigate that. But I think the other side that sometimes does get missed a lot is accepting consent, right? And not even from a, I'm trying to think of how to say this. I think just teaching kids to recognize what where consent is needed. So I'll give this and I will say like my son, I love him to death. He has a brain condition that makes him very impulsive. He's got high ADHD, and one of those things is he likes constant stimulation. So he's one of those kids that will just run up and like slam into you. He likes like a lot of pressure points. Like he's one of those kids, and again, he's my son. I love him, but we've had to do a lot of work with him on what is my body telling you, right? And he has his younger sister. She's 3. So she's 3 years old. She can't always communicate consent, right? She's 3. She's not going to say, I don't like how you're touching me right now. Like he'll be tickling her. And so we'll do a lot of lessons around, he'll sometimes be, he might be tickling her and she's starting to get upset. And I'm like, what is her body telling you? Like, does she look like she's enjoying this? Does she look happy? Does she seem like she's getting stressed out? So I think a lot of times that's another part we miss with kids is we'll do, it's kind of like with bullying. We'll do great of teaching them like how not to bully, but we don't do a great job of being like, here's how to be resilient to that, right? Like here's how to hear the word no and not just be okay with it, but be supportive of it, right? If a partner's telling you like, I don't want to have sex, how to not just be like, okay, right? But how to really like embrace that and be supportive. I think that's a big thing we miss out with kids a lot too.
Yeah, well, and you bring up such a great point because I absolutely think that that is a part that's missed, right? And then I think you have like the people who are like, oh, I was rejected, right? And then it becomes this like very like internalized thing versus being able to support your partner and just being like, yes, I understand. It's not, you're not having horrible thoughts about me. I'm not the worst person ever. It's not that you find me unattractive. It's just a no right now.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. I think that's such a good point, right? I think people go to the extremes of, right, no means no. And I'm like, yeah, sure. When someone's like, very, angry and articulately telling you no, like, that might be a red flag. But yeah, what about those to your point as an adult where it's like, hey, like, if my partner loves me, why don't they want to cuddle me right now? Or why don't they want to have sex with me? And even as teens, right? Like, well, they already had sex with this person. Why won't they have sex with me? I think that's such a good point, understanding how not to internalize it and embrace it in a really positive, supportive way. Everybody would be a lot happier, I think.
Well, and then I think too about all the kids I work with that have had like maybe not in a way like the classical traumatic sexual relationships, but they've had sexual relationships that for whatever reason like weren't healthy or safe for them and they don't yet have the words to identify it, right? And so like through our work it's trying to understand like what was that about for you and what do you need to do in the future to make sure that like you do feel safe in those relationships and that you do feel confident in like what you're like what you're saying. And I do think that there's a lot of partners in that situation that like don't necessarily understand like what bad sexual experiences mean. Because they're like, oh, it was just a bad sexual experience. And it's like, how do we help people understand what a bad sexual experience really looks and feels like without having to just like give them a story every time?
I actually say that a lot. And again, it's always so hard because I think these partners, so many times they're great people. They're so well intentioned. But a big thing I see, I do work with a lot of people who have had, sexual trauma in their past. And a lot of times their partners will say, just remember, I'm not them. I'm not your attacker. I'm not your abuser. And, I think that it comes from a really good place, but it's kind of that idea of separate out your experience from me, right? And just keep those separate and we'll be okay, right? And there's not that ability for the partner to really understand, hey, you are not this person. You did not do this to your partner, but you need to understand the impact psychologically it's had on them and that is not an experience that can be untangled very easily, right? Or if ever sometimes, and that's okay too.
But I think at the end of the day, it's like, how are you helping to support like working through it? And I like that's such a valid conversation to have. And like these are the things again, like I know teenagers may or may not want to talk to their parents about sex, but I feel like when you have a teenager who's at home, let's say they're a sophomore, junior, senior in high school, and they're like dating someone and they're starting to have these like conversations or starting to ask questions or be curious, I would so much rather that they're home under your roof where you can have these kind of consistent conversations and you can bring it up and you can ask different things and you can observe than to have them be like in college having some of those initial experiences. And granted, I would never want someone to date or have sex if they were not ready or wanting it, right? Like that's a caveat. But if you have a kid who's like, I want this relationship, I'm curious about this, I want to try this. I think with having a parent home and having someone that can observe and like have those conversations is like such a critical like scaffolding for adulthood.
It's funny you bring that up because I think, and I would put this in the unpopular opinion category, maybe sometimes for some people, because I think a lot of parents are nervous to talk about sex, or I mean, honestly, I've seen this with like drugs, alcohol, sex, because they can tell that their child isn't there yet, right? So it's almost this fear of, well, if I bring this topic up, they're going to start paying attention to it. They're going to start looking, right? Almost like, am I going to kickstart this thing that they're not ready for. And I think that's a great point. It's because, well, for, I'm going to go 99% of the population, they're going to get to a place in their life where they're going to have an experience with this. Like we've all, most of us in life have encountered a situation with drugs, whether being offered drugs, seeing drugs, like, right, or alcohol, and I think sex is the same thing. Like at some point in your life, you're going to have a sexual experience. So I think, like I said, I'd put this in the unpopular category, right? Where I say, I think if you normalize it from a young age, I mean, again, there's, developmentally appropriate ways to express it at different ages. But I think from a really young age, I think if we just normalized it with kids, it would be, so much just those conversations would be much easier when they do come up.
Like I think about other topics that like aren't taboo, right? Like working at a job or getting a puppy or driving. And how many times those things come up as the child grows up. And like if you have a 5-year-old, they're not driving a car yet, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
but for some reason, we're like, oh yeah, like we'll talk about all this and I'll tell you all this good information about how to drive a car, right? But then when it comes to sex, people are just like, oh no, like I'm gonna wait forever and just never have the conversation, or I'm gonna wait until they're like 17 and they've already done a whole bunch of Googling.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Before I preload any of this information. And you're right, like it doesn't have like we're not talking to second graders about like all of the nitty gritties with sex, right? But there are absolutely developmentally appropriate ways that you can kind of preload and introduce topics and give them more information as they're ready and prepared for it.
Yes, yes. I think because most kids ask, I mean, right, at 5 years old, a lot of kids are, where do babies come from, right? And that's such a, right? I would agree with that. You don't want to have that conversation of, well, this is what sex is, and this is how sex happens, and here's how to make a baby, right? You're not going to have that conversation with a 5-year-old, but I think you can start to introduce like one thing. It's kind of funny. I'm like, oh, now I have to start practice what I've been preaching for 10 years now that my kids are getting a little older. And like even just one of the things we've done is just around like body functions, making it not awkward, right? From a young age. I've just told my kids about, hey, mom gets her period once a month, right? And this is something, it's because of hormonal changes in my body. It means my body bleeds for once a month. And I just kept it very high level, very simple. And it was just like, yeah, this is what it is. And like, my son has gone to the store with me to buy tampons. So I'll be like, oh, wait, right. And I mean, again, I'll report back in 10 years to see how this went. But for 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 me, I'm like, I've just seen so many, boys especially that they find out girls have their period when they're 14 and their emotional maturity makes them go, ew, that's gross, right? And it's understandable and they reject that, right? Versus, he's known about it since he was 5 or 6, and now, my son is just like, oh yeah, that's a period. So I'm kind of hoping he'll be one of those kids that's just like, oh yeah, it's no big deal. He's not going to be grossed out. It'll just be, I've grown up with this. It's normalized. And so that's going to be, a conversation that's not going to be a big deal in the future.
Totally. Well, and I think about that. And I always say, obviously like the kids we're raising, like they're not adults and we're not expecting them to be adults tomorrow. But at some point, they're gonna be adults and they're gonna have partners and they're gonna have people and they're gonna have their own kids if that's the decision they make at some point in the future. I'm thinking about this and I'm like, how lovely would it be to like have a teen boy or a young man, right, in college who like understands that and is like, oh yeah, like that's just a thing that happens and it's like not gross and it's not weird and it's just like totally normalized. And I think about all the girls in relationships that are like, oh, I could never talk to my partner or my boyfriend about like my period or my cycle or this or that. And it's like, but why? Literally your body. And if you can't talk about like a very normal function, like how are you talking about like what you like and dislike, in sexual experiences and like what you like as far as like orgasms go? Like there's all these things that it's like if you can't talk about that.
Yes, yes. And I see so many people who are sexually inhibited because they feel awkward. Exactly. You feel awkward talking about how your body functions, right? Just from a a, a pure like biological standpoint, how are you going to talk about pleasure, right? That's such a huge jump, right? It's almost like, yeah, you gotta walk before you can run. And I see that a lot. I mean, again, I do sex therapy, so the number one issue people come to me with is, they don't enjoy their sex life. They're not getting satisfaction out of it. And a lot of it comes down to they can't even talk about, they either don't know what they like or they can't talk about what they like.
I'm curious, do you have Like if you're looking at your clients that are in their 30s and 40s, like are there things you like wish you could go back and like tell them or teach them in like teenagehood?
That's such a good question. Yes, I would say, and this relates to what we were just talking about, really taking the shame out of a lot of lessons for people. I think a lot of people sort of have this duality with their sexuality, which is they feel incredibly interested in it. It brings them a lot of pleasure, but they also feel incredible shame about it, right? Through negative experience of, right, an adult, like we don't talk about those things, or like that's not appropriate, blah, 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 blah. And like a lot of those shame-based messages, but then meanwhile, it's like they're seeing porn from like their friends or something, or they, right? And it's arousing and they really like it. And so I think for a lot of people, I think sex in adulthood comes with a lot of shame. And if I could go back for a lot of them, I'd think that would be so cathartic to be able, again, to talk about sex in a way that isn't icky or gross or shameful, but just have it be really normalized. I think people would be just a lot better off. And if there wasn't as much shame, there would be more education on it. You could talk about it more. And if there was more education, I think people would have much healthier relationships than what I see a lot of the time.
No, I'm so glad you brought up the shame piece because I do feel like, and even when I'm thinking about like the messages, like I don't know if you're a Taylor Swift fan, but when she went to like one of the football games, you had all these guys, these like dads, right? That were like trashing her, that were like, you know, get the F out of football, like whatever. She's a terrible person. And even someone like that who is so wildly successful in such in a way where it's based on her brain and her experiences and like she's creating and crafting all these things and they also have negative things to say about her. And I think about that messaging and I think about compared to like the messaging that even I hear in like the grocery store when people are talking about things. And it's like there's so much around like being a whore, being a slut, being like all of these things, right? Like sex work, right? Which like I think is so valid in like its own right. And I think about all the shame that that kind of entails, just like being the experience of being female in a lot of ways is like can't be all of the things, but they expect you to be all of the things. And then at the end of the day, like you also have to feel bad about like what you want. And like it's just it's such an interesting intertwinement. Is that's even a word?
Oh no, 100%. I talked to I so in my one of my courses that I do online, this is a big section. I kind of say like, hey, there's a disclaimer to this part of the course, and it talks about masculine and feminine sexuality. When I put it out there, I'm like, hey, this is not a gender thing. This is just like different sides of a spectrum. But I always think it's such this interesting, I do think it's an interesting dichotomy where I think women carry in society a lot of this shame, right? We typically get a lot of those messages of, you know, yeah, don't be a slut, don't be a whore. I always thought it was weird. We talk about like, oh, be careful who you give your virginity to. And I'm like, we're acting like we're giving something away. I would rather it be, hey, when you have sex for the first time, here's what you should be getting. You should be getting a comfortable experience. You should be getting a pleasurable experience as much as a, you know, maybe if it's a teenage, you know, boy, like, you know, he's probably not going to be Casanova, but he should be trying, right? He should be trying to give you, I don't know. We talk about giving it, and we really teach, I think, women to not be sexualized. And then the funniest thing is I will have, and again, it's a lot of heterosexual couples, and they're well intentioned, but it's a lot of these women who have grown up with this purity mindset, right? Don't, you know, don't enjoy your own pleasure because that's slutty and that's bad. And then they get married, they start a family, and they're like, now I can breathe. Now sex doesn't have to be a part of my life because it's never been enjoyable for them, right? And they love that message of like, okay, now I, you know, this can just fade off, and their husbands will get so understandably upset. Why doesn't my wife want to have sex with me? Right? Why doesn't she not? So I'm like, because she's, and a lot of them, it's kind of funny. There'll be a lot of times these men that are like, you know, I'm not going to let anyone date my daughter. And I'm like, right. So you've had a woman who's grown up with this purity mindset, therefore has never enjoyed sex. And now later on in her life doesn't want to make it a priority. And now you're confused and upset. So I'm like, we as a society are screwing ourselves. I'm like, all these men who are, I'm like, your lives are all kind of sucking because we've taught women don't be sexual. And then we all get married, or not we all, but like a lot of times we'll get in these relationships and it, why doesn't she want to have sex with me? Because she's never been taught how to enjoy it. So it's like society is just screwing itself over, I think, a lot of times.
Well, I think I mean maybe this isn't a direct thing that like I discussed like during my sessions because it's a little explicit, but I think about, I feel like when you're talking about like women's enjoyment, right? You're talking about kind of like embracing sexuality and like having the power of it. And so it's not something I directly talk about because I feel like a lot of my kids, like the teens are just trying to start figuring out like what that is. But I think there's a really beautiful narrative and like really having women embrace their sexuality in ways that like feel good for them. Right. So like I had a teenager, she's an older teenager, 17, and she really wanted to try pole dancing. And the parents were like, absolutely not. That's disgusting. That's sending everyone the wrong message, right? Like you'll be a whore, like whatever, right? They in their own right were like, we don't want to support and encourage this. But when we had talked about it, this kid has had like not great sexual experiences and was having a really hard time with her own boundaries and understanding how to like discuss them and talk about them. And so after like months of trying was I really just think you should give it a try because I think you're going to see a different change even in her ability to hold boundaries in her own in her life and like academic and friendships and whatever. And like lo and behold, was allowed to like go and try pole dancing, did a great class. It was a fantastic intro class in Massachusetts. And she like left that class and was like, I feel so powerful and I feel so strong and like my own will as a person. And like there have been so many conversations we've had that have been based off of that. And I just wish there was more openness to even stuff like that and like embracing all of that. Cause like we have so much power.
Yes, yes. I think about that and I truly feel like society isn't ready for this, but I'm like, if I, because people have asked, oh, would you ever want to do, are you interested in sex education in school? And I said, yes, but I would probably never be hired because my message with sex education would be, here's how to have pleasurable sex. Because I think, again, and again, age appropriate, right? I'm not going to go into a room full of 15-year-olds and start talking about, every kink that's on the planet and, showing them a bunch of sex toys, but just talking about it from the concept of pleasure and embodying that and identifying what works for you. Because I think kids would have better boundaries because they'd be coming at it from the mindset of this should be something really beautiful. This should be something really this should be a positive experience, right? And I think so many of them go into it with shame and pressure and it becomes a negative experience, right? So I think we talk about sex from a restrictive, and this is a good part of the lesson, right? I think learning about STDs, learning about the risk of pregnancies, that needs to be part of the conversation for sure. That's a very important point, but we kind of just leave it there, right? You could get pregnant, you could get a disease, don't do it. But yeah, but I think right, a teen doing pole dancing, I think I just embodying that confidence. I think is confidence and positivity is huge.
Well, and I think too, like when I think about like, movement and like a well-rounded holistic life, we talk about keeping our bodies healthy, we talk about like moving our bodies, we talk about like eating and drinking and all this other stuff. And it's like when we're talking about like holistic wellness, that should also be a part of it, is like how do you engage in having really healthy pleasurable sex and being able to build that in a very early capacity and like their own sexual experiences. Cause like, again, I think about this all the time and I'm like, if we had a world without trauma, how much further could we go as a society, right? If like we didn't have to sit here and heal everything and we could just like really start fresh and give people the information they're looking for. So, and I think about that with like sexual experiences and I'm just like, I have, folks that I've worked with that are like, they've had horrible experiences. Now, granted, sometimes purposeful, sometimes not, but like, if we didn't have to do that work, like how much further could we get in life and how much like more could we give to different things?
Yes. Yeah. 100%. I think the world would be a better place if we all just focused a little bit more on pleasure.
I know. And like doing things that just feel good. I don't know. I'm a big person, like people make fun of me because I love CrossFit and I love to run. And there's a lot of people that are like, oh, I would never run a marathon. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of other things I would never do. I love it in particular because I have a kid who's like, don't yuck my yum. And that's what they
I
say.
was just saying, I say that all the time. I say that expression all the time. Don't yuck somebody else's yum, right? Who cares?
And that's the thing I think that's really, really powerful with shame is to just like, it's not my cup of tea, right? Like there are definitely things that aren't my cup of tea, but like I'm not going to tell you anything is a really terrible idea unless it's a safety concern.
Exactly, right? And even then with the safety concerns, a lot of time I'm like, yeah, as long as you're not hurting somebody else, and if there's a safety concern, right, know how to manage it, right? Know how to navigate it. Like, yeah, I agree.
Harm reduction, that's definitely the thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we did have one question
Sure.
And actually, I would love to get your thoughts on this. Does watching porn negatively affect relationships? Do you have thoughts on this?
I do. I have lots of thoughts on this. Whenever I get these questions, I'm so annoying because I know people love to look for like a yes or a no. And my answer is always, it depends. It really depends.
I love it. Okay. I wonder if we have the same rationale.
Yeah. So I think porn for me falls in the category of how you use it in your relationship, right? I think it's okay. You just brought up exercise. I think it's very similar to exercise, and it's not the thing, it's how you use it, right? If you exercise to keep your body healthy and you enjoy it, it's a like a social support, like those are all good things. But you can also use exercise in a really harmful way because there's some body dysmorphia issues, or you can be harming yourself because you're exercising over, hanging out with your friends or doing it. And I would put porn in this category. It really depends on how you use it. For a lot of I see, adults, porn can be a really healthy aspect of the relationship. They like to watch it together. It turns them on. It's something for them to maybe enjoy when their partner's not around, things like, and I think if you keep it in that healthy category where both parties are consenting to it, there's an understanding that, porn does not always translate into real life. And it's just kind of kept, again, in that pleasure category. I think it can be really helpful. Where I see porn become very destructive is when, and I think this applies for teenagers, that porn becomes an expectation for reality. And I think really helping teenagers understand that, right? And, something I'll say is like, I love Marvel. I'm like, I don't watch an Avengers movie and say that that happens in real life, right? Porn is the same thing. These people are actors, they're professionals. There's a lot of staging and, techniques that go into this. So you can enjoy it for the cinematic aspects, but recognize that it's not real life, right? So I think when people use it in a way that they expect what they see in porn that's harmful, or it's replacing connection in their relationship, right? If you're watching porn and you'd rather jack off while you're, or play with yourself while, maybe your partner wants to connect and you're ignoring that connection in favor of this, like that's where it's really harmful. So, and again, I think this is part of that having conversations early, understanding that most kids earlier than what most people think on average. If you ask the average person, like, hey, when's the first, even if it's not porn on the internet, like they saw, you know, someone naked in a magazine or or something, like it's usually earlier than we think, and teaching them to understand, like, there's aspects of this, they're not always real, and having healthier conversations around porn.
No, because I 1,000% agree with you. Because I definitely think like in the true harm reduction lens that I usually take with things is that anything in moderation can be okay. Murder, that's not okay in any
Yeah.
moderation. I just was like anything, and I was like, most things. Most things.
There's some caveats, yeah.
So most things in moderation are fine. And I
Yeah.
I think that like with porn, it's the same thing around like what narrative do you want them to have? What understanding do you want them to have around porn, right? And like I work the kids, the youngest age I work with are like 8 and 9, depending on kind of like what the issues are. And like I have kids as young as 10 and 11 that are accessing porn. It's not even for like oh, this turns me on type thing, but it's like they're curious, they're talking about bodies in school, and I would much rather they understand what porn is and the role that it plays than just to like have an internet search and like not understand those pieces. So I think for me, like it is a gray area. And part of me is like, is it impacting their relationship? Is it getting in the way of like their own exploration? Do they have an understanding of like the reality of like what that actually is? And like in that terms, then I always talk about, the difference between like sex work and then additionally like the idea of like folks that are paid versus folks that are like, being assaulted on camera. And like sometimes it's hard to kind of like distinguish what those things are. And so I think it's a lot of like helping them understand the background to it, and then understanding too like the future structure and ramifications of like how and when they choose to engage in it. And I know that there's a lot of research out there that's like, oh, it's like terrible and it's bad and it's whatever. But I feel like you could say the same thing about coffee. You could say the same thing about energy drinks. You can say the same thing about like, canned fruits and vegetables.
Sugar, you could say that about sugar, right? There, like, what has there ever been a study that's come out and is like, yes, like sugar is good for you. You should do, right? And no, and sometimes I'll say this with my clients. Sometimes I'll say, hey, just context wise, this is complicated, right? And it's okay to talk about that it's complicated. I think even the history of sex work, I think is fascinating and how we treat sex work as a society, right? And I think those are great conversations. I mean, again, that's, I know kids can only handle so much kind of idea, but I think right. We can, I think they can handle a lot more than we give them credit for a lot. But I think even bringing that up, right? Hey, porn is a complicated topic, I think, and even giving them that context is important.
Yeah. And again, it's like, I think it's age appropriate conversations that kind of like match where they're at, right? And emotionally. And I think that there are, folks that are, 13, 14 that I work with that have zero interest. They're just like, I don't care. I don't want to talk about it. It's not a thing for me. And then I have kids that are the same age that are like asking me tons of different questions because they just don't know where to find reliable information. And so I think, part of it, it's like you have to take where your kid's at, but then you also have to do some preloading around like, what is the narrative that you're going to have in regards to this? And knowing that like that narrative could be something that impacts them their entire life.
Yeah, yeah. I think the preloading is such an important part for the kids too, right? Because I think most people I have talked to, first time they encountered porn was by accident, right? It was either a friend that was on the computer or it was like an older cousin that was like, hey, look at this magazine. Like, you do have a handful of kids that will go out and like, on the school computer or something, but a lot of people stumble across their first experience with seeing a naked body, a naked adult body, or seeing porn by accident. And so I think even preloading those conversations with kids, like, hey, if you ever see something that confuses you or that you enjoy, but you don't really know what you're looking at, right? You don't even have to have a conversation with, yeah, like an 8 or a 9-year-old and say, hey, if you see porn, come and tell me, right? But you can say, like, oh, yeah, there's like a lot of weird stuff on the internet. If you ever see something that you have questions about, like something, it could be something you liked, but you're not sure what you're looking at. Maybe if you saw something that confused you, like, you can always come and ask me, or again, ask your trusted adult. So I think even preloading, again, you can kind of prep them for it. They're probably going to see this at some point. They're going to have questions. And right, if you have that open door policy of you've had that age appropriate conversation, maybe, yeah, with 7, 8, 9, 10-year old, you're not telling them what porn is, but you're opening the door for here's how we can have this conversation when that topic eventually will come up.
Yeah. And reinforcing that you're a safe person that they can talk to about it and that you'll do your best to answer those questions and like, they're not going to be alone in trying to understand like what all these things are. I think there's safety and connection. And I think if you have that connection and you've like kind of given them a little bit of the narrative that's age appropriate, I think they're just going to feel so much more secure in being able to say like, hey, like what is this? Or like, what does this all mean? And I know that that's really tricky. And I would encourage like parents, if you're struggling to like, hook up with a therapist or someone who can kind of like help support that and seek some resources. Cause I just think we want you to have the skills to be able to have that conversation.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I know, and it's hard. It's so, like I said, I'm kind of encountering this with my kids. I've been talking about this for years from the clinical side, and now I'm a parent. I'm like, oh gosh, like it is. It's hard. It's hard to put these things into practice. And I think for a lot of people, it's like that's a skill in and of itself, right? We're trying to teach our kids skills and we're learning them at the same time as parents, as caregivers. So it's hard. I can definitely understand from both sides.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation too. So you had mentioned some courses. Are you the facilitator of said courses? Do you want to tell us about them?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I kind of funny. They were sort of born out of the pandemic. I'm sure when the pandemic happened, just therapy exploded. I could barely get back to everybody who was calling me. And kind of funny what we're talking about here. I think a lot of what I do in couples therapy, it's a lot of the same skills over and over again. So there's these really common patterns I see with sex therapy. Oh, hey, maybe you're trying to connect in this way because you've always thought of your desire as working in this way, but sometimes it works in this way for people. So here's how you want to approach it with this. So, or with couples, it'd be, oh, if you communicate in this way, this is what that might signal. Here's a different way you communicate. So a lot of it came down to like every couple is different, but the skills needed to have a healthy relationship are very similar. So during the pandemic, I had so many people reaching out and I just couldn't get back to them and I had no way to refer them to anybody. So I just said, you know what? I'm just going to develop these like online courses. At least it was more out of guilt than anything. I was like, I can at least refer people to something, right? Hey, I can't see you, but this will hold you over until I can get you in or someone else can. So I have two online courses right now. There's a couples connected one and a sex and intimacy one. And yeah, from the pandemic, they just kind of took off because so the couples connected one goes over like all aspects of relationships. So it'll talk about communication, conflict resolution, handling finances, how to manage stress, just kind of an all-encompassing, here's how you can have a healthy relationship. And then the sex and intimacy one is a little bit more focused on, developing a really healthy romantic relationship, how to encompass all aspects of intimacy into your relationship, and then obviously going into pleasurable sex and how to enhance that in your relationship. So I offer those two online courses now. And I like them because I think they're good for people who are, maybe busy, can't devote an hour every week or every other week. Like again, young kids over here, I'm like, oh, I can, if I had something I could do at, 11 o'clock at night when I had time, like that's great. So I offer those for people online right now.
I really want to build resources that are accessible to people. And like I love like the idea of courses and webinars because you can do them at midnight. You can do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. You can do it when you have 20 minutes. Totally get the commitment and the time that it takes to get to therapy and to find the right person, whatever. And sometimes like all of those courses are just like a primer for like the work that you feel like you'd want to do in therapy. I love the idea of that. And that's part of what I'm building on like Teens Uncharted is like how many webinars can we put together that really help people like parent and provides resources and like and just access so that people get it and they're getting it like from reputable sources and it's reliable information and it's like digestible. All right, guys. Well, coming soon.
Coming to TV. I was gonna say, if anybody out there is, yeah, feel free, send us ideas. What questions what
I
questions do
know.
you need?
I know, right? Seriously, it's like we can build an entire course around all of the stuff that you guys want to know, which would I think be fantastic. So, and I actually realized I forgot to have you do an intro kind of in the beginning. So, do you want to give us like a quick spiel of like you and like, how people can find you, what your work is?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I have a website, speaktz.com, and that's where my online courses are. I just started a TikTok. I have an Instagram, speaktzma@gmail.com. I will say, speaking of teens, I give them so much credit for their social media game because I'm like, I don't know how you guys do this. It's so hard. They make all these, I'm like, they have these 15-year-olds. They make all these like cool reels and like I have a couple of my younger clients. I'm like, you guys are so creative. I don't know how you do it. But I do try to post on there so people can find me on there. And then my email is speaktzma@gmail.com. I love this. This was honestly so much fun. I loved it.
I'd love to have you back and talk more about like shame and how to kind of like unburden that. And so I'd love to talk more about it.
Yeah, yeah, I would be happy to do that. I love talking about this stuff. So
I give you so much credit for what you're doing because I know that there's a lot of therapists that are like very uncomfortable in talking about it. And like we need more people that are just like, no, put it on the table. Nothing is like shameful here. Like we can talk about anything. Well, Brittney, thank you so much for connecting today and for sharing all of your knowledge.
thank you so much for having me today. This was great. It was really wonderful. I appreciate it.
Yes, you're so welcome. I'll talk to you soon.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.